12.1a is on simple probability. So we're going to spend Unit 12 talking about probability, and probability is just the number of favorable outcomes over the number of total outcomes. So we're going to express our probability as a fraction, and it always needs to be in simplest form. Probability is different than odds, which are the number of favorable outcomes over the unfavorable outcomes. In this unit, again, we're just going to be looking at the favorable over total. So there are a couple different ways to represent probability. We're going to be using the fraction most often, which would just be 1 over 2. So this is 1 favorable outcome over 2 total possible outcomes. We could write it as a decimal, so that would be 0.5, or we could express it as a percent. 50% is the probability. We also have something called theoretical probability versus experimental probability. So theoretical probability is what should happen, and experimental probability is what did happen. So for example, if you're trying to figure out the probability of getting heads when flipping a coin, well, what should happen is that half of the time you should get tails, right? So 50%, or half of the time you should get tails and half the time you should get heads. But if you actually flipped your coin, say 10 times, it might not come out 5 times tails, 5 times heads. So experimental is when you actually do that experiment, what really did happen in that situation. We also have a couple things to remember. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at decks of cards, so you're going to need to remember, or you'll get a cheat sheet with all this information about cards on them. There are 52 total cards in a deck, 26 red, 26 black. The suits are the pictures on the card, so we have a heart, a diamond, a spade, which kind of looks like an upside down heart, and a club, which kind of looks like a 4-leaf clover. There are 4 face cards. They're called face cards because the king, the queen, and the jack all have faces on them, so there are 4 of each of those. Additionally, remember that a perfect square is just the product of a number multiplied by itself. So for example, 16 is a perfect square because 4 times 4 is 16. And a prime number is a number that has exactly 2 factors. So for example, 7 is a prime number because its factors are 1 and 7. Now that we have a little bit of background, let's practice finding some probabilities. So in a standard deck of cards, we want to find the probability of the following. So we want to find the probability of drawing a heart. Well, there are 13 hearts in a deck of cards, right? That's one of the suits. So that means there are 13 favorable outcomes and a total of 52 outcomes because there are 52 cards in a deck. Then we want to put it in simplest form. Well, 13 goes into 13 once and 13 goes into 52 4 times. So the probability of drawing a heart is 1/4. Let's look at the probability of drawing an 8. Well, there are 4 8s in a deck of cards. 8 of hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades. So that means there are 4 favorable outcomes out of our 52 total. So when we simplify that, we'll get the probability of drawing an 8 is 1/13. How about the probability of drawing a face card? Well, remember our face cards, we have 4 kings, we have 4 queens, and we have 4 jacks. So that is a total of 12 cards out of our 52 possible outcomes. Well, 4 goes into 12 3 times, 4 goes into 52 13 times, so the probability of drawing a face card is 3 out of 13. Last but not least, the probability of drawing a red 6. Well, there are 4 6s in a deck of cards, but 2 of them are black and 2 of them are red. So that means that the 2 favorable outcomes are the 2 of hearts and 2 of diamonds out of 52 total options, so the probability of drawing a red 6 is 1/26. Okay, this would be a good time to pause and see if you can look at the next couple for yourself. Now we've got this spinner, so we want to calculate the probability of this spinner landing on a 5. Well, our spinner has the numbers 1 through 10, so there are 10 total outcomes that are possible. Looking at our spinner, there's only 1 5 on there, so that means there's 1 favorable outcome out of 10 possible, so 1/10 is our probability. Again, now would be a good time to pause, try the other 2 for yourself. The probability of landing on a prime number, well, remember prime numbers are numbers with 2 factors, so 2 is a prime number, 3 is a prime number, 5 is a prime number, and 7 is a prime number. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 prime numbers out of 10 total options, so that simplifies to 2/5 is the probability of landing on a prime. Remember, 1 isn't a prime number. 1 is neither prime nor composite. Last but not least, the probability of landing on a perfect square. Well, 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, and 3 times 3 is 9. So we have 1, 2, 3 perfect squares on our spinner, so 3/10 is the probability of landing on a perfect square. Let's do 3 more. So you select a number at random from the numbers 2 to 15. So that'd be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. All right, so looking at those from 2 to 15, that gives us a total of 14 outcomes that we are looking at. All right, so we just need to figure out the favorable outcomes for each of these. Now this notation, P parentheses even, that is telling you to find the probability of whatever is in the parentheses. So letter A is finding the probability of the number being even. That's all that notation means. All right, so the probability of the number being even, well, if we're looking, half of these are even, right? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So that is half of our numbers. So we have 7 favorable outcomes out of 14 total outcomes. So our probability of being even is 1/2. How about the probability of being prime? Well, remember prime numbers just have exactly 2 factors. 2 is a prime number, 3. 4 is 4 times 1 and 2 times 2, so 4 is not prime. 5 is prime, 7, 11, and 13 are prime. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 favorable outcomes, or 6 prime numbers, out of our total of 14. Well, 2 goes into 6 3 times, 2 goes into 14 7 times, so 3/7 is our probability of drawing a prime number. Last but not least, the probability of picking a perfect square. Well, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9. Those are our only perfect squares, so we have 2 favorable outcomes out of 14 total outcomes, so that would be the probability of 1/7. So this is our simple probability, and the most important thing to remember is that that definition of probability is the number of favorable outcomes over the number of total outcomes.